Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Kowalski zooming in with a continuation of our virtual speaker series for the Yacht Club. Tonight we have a special guest, Donovan Moore, who's a Sausalito resident, an author and a reporter. He's well known in the community and has written an outstanding book which has gotten excellent reviews on Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin. The video and slideshow will start shortly. Mr. Moore will be obviously taking questions and answers, and the book is available commercially, but also specifically available at Sausalito Bay by the Books with Cheryl Pop and her group. So kindly welcome to Sausalito Yacht Club, Mr. Donovan Moore.
Okay, Tom, thank you. And I see people clapping on mute. That's nice. And thanks to the Sausalito Yacht Club. You know, a couple months ago when we were scheduling this, we thought we were all going to be at the Yacht Club. But these videos kind of work, so thank you all for tuning in. I read recently in the New York Times, that's where I get all my news and political opinion, that when you're in quarantine, it's good to find ways to interact. You feel better when you participate. So as we go through this presentation, I encourage you to write down your questions, submit them at any time. We'll do a little brief Q&A at the end. Now, What Stars Are Made Of is the first book I've ever written, and this is the first video I've ever done. So in the spirit of asking questions, I have one for all of you. How does it feel to be a guinea pig? Okay. So with that in mind, I'm going to go through some slides. I think you're going to find them interesting. If you make them large on your screen, you'll be able to see them. So if you use the speaker mode rather than gallery, I think that would be better. So grab your glass of wine. I have mine, and let's begin. Okay. Do we look good, Russell? I think we do. Okay. So whenever I tell someone that I've written a book, a biography of a woman scientist, the very first question, without fail, is, how did you get that idea? So I'm going to tell you, and that's probably what most of you are thinking right now. Years ago, before I sold out to Wall Street, I used to write. I wrote for the Boston Globe, Rolling Stone, newspaper and magazine pieces mostly. Now and then a screenplay. They were all purchased. None of them were made. It was frustrating. But what I always wanted to write was a book. So in the spring of 2016, I took a friend, Lanny Jones, to lunch. Lanny had retired as the managing editor of People magazine, and he had written a biography, and I wanted to talk to him about the isolation of research, how do you handle it, things like that. Lanny knew I had an interest in science and technology. He also knew I wanted to write a book. So he said he would send me the materials from a course he was auditing at Princeton called The Universe. And so he did. There we go. And as I was leafing through it, I came upon a page with 3 photographs, no names, just 3 photos. I recognized the 2 men, Aristotle and Newton. Who's the woman? Literally on the same page as these eminent scientists. It was, of course, Cecilia Payne. I was intrigued, so I started to poke around. First, there was that photograph. It wasn't a picture of Cecilia herself. It was of her oil portrait. Patricia Watwood, an American portraitist, had painted it from a montage of 25 separate photos. She had based it on the Astronomer, the 1668 Vermeer oil on canvas that hangs in the Louvre today. The portrait was commissioned in 2002 by Dudley Hirschbach, a Nobel-winning professor of chemistry at Harvard, and his wife, Georgine. I'll tell you more about this in a few minutes. At the dedication ceremony for the portrait, Jeremy Knowles, Dean of the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences, said, "Every high school student knows that Newton discovered gravity, that Darwin discovered evolution, even that Einstein discovered relativity. But when it comes to the composition of our universe, the textbooks simply say that the most prevalent element in the universe is hydrogen, and no one ever wonders how we know." Now I'm really intrigued. I kept poking, and what I found was this amazing inspirational story of a woman who had to overcome unbelievable odds, personal, professional, academic, to make one of the most fundamental discoveries in all of science. And no one had written a book about her. I had my idea. So I retired from private banking. I actually hate that word. I like to say I changed jobs. And I started to research. I read Cecilia's memoir. I traveled to Cambridge, England, where I rode a bicycle all over the university, day and night, because I wanted to know what it was like for Cecilia in the 1920s. And I studied old photographs. Cecilia was born in 1900 in Wendover, a small British village 40 miles northwest of London. Her father, Edward, died when she was only 4 years old. She was raised by her mother, Emma. And early on, she had a relentless curiosity. That's Cecilia on the right with her brother and sister. When she won a botany contest, she got to choose any book she wanted, which would then be bound in leather. The school expected her to choose either Shakespeare or Milton. She chose a book on fungi. She had little patience for organized religion. She once asked a London bookbinder to put a fake cover on the Apology and inscribe Holy Bible on the spine so that her teachers would think she was working on her religion studies instead of reading Plato. The bookbinder refused to do it. It was an attitude that finally got her expelled at 16, with just 1 year of school left before college. Most girls at the time went to a finishing school to get prepared for marriage. Luckily for Cecilia and for science, she was accepted to St. Paul's School for Girls in London. This was no finishing school. It was serious, and it was a school made for her. The minute she walked in the door, she said to herself, "I shall never be lonely again. Now I can think about science." Her goal was to go to Cambridge University, so she spent that last year studying all the time Newtonian equations of motion, thermodynamics, astronomy. It was a wild year, and she did it. She was accepted to Cambridge on a scholarship in the fall of 1919. Now, Cambridge had been, for 700 years, strictly all men. In 1865, when women started making noises about going to Cambridge, a geology professor at the time pronounced them to be nasty forward minxes. It was not until 1871 that women were finally accepted to the university. When Cecilia, neither nasty nor a minx, but definitely forward, enrolled, she was a freshman at Newnham, one of two colleges for women at Cambridge. It was understood at the time that men studied mathematics, women majored in botany. So she dutifully checked the botany box with physics as a minor. Everything changed, though, after only a few months when this man came back into town. His name is Arthur Eddington. With his starched collar, his perfectly knotted silk tie, the pince nez, just the hint of a smile, he looked like he knew more about what you were going to say than you did. He was supremely confident. This is how he opened chapter 11 of his book, Philosophy of Physical Science. "I believe there are, whatever that number is, protons in the universe and the same number of electrons." I mean, how do you argue with that, right? Eddington was director of the Cambridge Observatory and had just returned from Principe off the coast of West Africa. He had gone there in May of 1919 to demonstrate the validity of Einstein's theory of relativity by photographing a solar eclipse. You'll have to read the book to get the details, but suffice to say, he did it. The New York Times, on short notice, assigned the coverage to Henry Crouch, the paper's golf reporter. It was said at the time that Henry would have been the first to admit that he was not an expert in the mathematics of four-dimensional spacetime. But Henry did perceive that something extraordinary had taken place. Eddington came back to Cambridge in December of that year to give a lecture on the results of his solar expedition. Now, I put this slide in to show you the scale of things at Cambridge. This is the entrance to the dining hall at Trinity College. People apparently were much shorter back then. So Eddington strides into the Trinity dining hall to give his lecture, and it was all anyone could talk about. By anyone, I mean men. There were only 4 women in the audience. One of the original 4 couldn't go, so she gave her ticket to Cecilia. That woman, lost to history, could not have foreseen that it would mark a turning point in Cecilia's life. After Eddington finished, she raced back to her dorm and transcribed Eddington's lecture word for word into a notebook. She recalled at the time, "For 3 nights, I think I did not sleep. My world had been so shaken that I experienced something like a nervous breakdown." She was done with botany. She switched her major to physics with all the astronomy she could pick up on the side. Now, physics was taught at the famed Cavendish Laboratory. To study physics back then, you had to use your hands to work with glass tubes and wires and electrical coils. At Cambridge, however, mathematics ruled, and mathematicians worked with their minds. They decidedly did not work with their hands. So the physicists at Cambridge had to disguise where they worked. And often the best place to hide something is right in plain sight. Thus, the Cavendish Lab, the birthplace of modern physics, where scientists ultimately would conduct experiments in nuclear fission, was not located somewhere out in the countryside, but right in the middle of town, behind a Gothic entrance with 18-inch walls, where the window boxes held not flowers, but helioscopes that drove sunlight into the lab. To get to the lab from Newnham, Cecilia had to have two things, a bicycle and a hat. Before a woman could enter the center of town, she had to have her head covered. I don't have a picture of Cecilia back then, so you just have to imagine a young woman on a bike in Edwardian dress, wearing the required hat, and avoiding horse droppings as she crossed the River Cam on a cold winter morning. Now, physics was taught in Maxwell Lecture Theater, a cavernous room with 28-foot ceiling and wooden plank floors. Because Cecilia was a woman, the only woman in a class of 30, she had to sit in the front row. The physics professor was also the head of the lab, Ernest Rutherford. Before he became a physicist, he had won the 1908 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. He would gaze directly at Cecilia and begin each lecture with, "Ladies and gentlemen." Cecilia would remember that all the boys regularly greeted this witticism with thunderous applause, stamping with their feet in the traditional manner, and at every lecture, I wished I could sink into the earth. When she wasn't at the Cav lab, she could be found in an observatory. First, she discovered the little one out back of her dorm, the Newnham Observatory. Now, I took this picture, so I can tell you it is little more than a hut housing a small telescope. She snuck out one night, opened the hatch, fixed the clock that kept the telescope aimed correctly, and then installed a notebook with instructions that observers had to record their findings with a signature and a date. Her closest friend at Newnham, another freshman named Betty Leaf, wrote in the school newspaper that Cecilia was now to be found on starry nights among the moths and dusts of Newnham Observatory, showing the wonders of the heavens to all who come. There was, of course, another observatory. The Cambridge Observatory was a 10-minute bicycle ride away. And when it was open to the public, Cecilia would bike there at night. It was very safe. This was Cambridge University. No one gave a second look to a young woman in Edwardian dress pedaling hard up Mattingly Road. This is what it looked like then. This is what it looks like today. Not much has changed. This observatory had a considerably bigger telescope. It was known as the Sheepshanks telescope, a 12.5-inch refractor. One night, she asked so many penetrating questions that the assistant, poor little Henry Green, ran out of the observatory, scurried into the main building, and told the director that he needed help. "Sir," he said, "there's a woman out there asking questions." The sir he was referring to was Arthur Eddington. When Eddington walked over to the telescope, Cecilia wasted no time in telling him that she wished to be an astronomer. His rather laconic response was, "I see no insuperable objection." When she later said the same thing to F.J.M. Stratton, a lecturer in astrophysics, his response was, "You can never hope to be anything but an amateur." Now, Cecilia endured these kinds of comments, endured derision in the classroom because of the timing. She was learning physics from the very scientists, Rutherford, Eddington, Niels Bohr, who were making great discoveries. As her friend Betty Leaf put it, she is most completely happy when some beautiful mathematical theory of the universe makes her forget the minor disturbances of everyday life. As Cecilia's 4 years at Cambridge wound down, she had to figure out what to do upon graduating. She got help from this man, Leslie L.J. Comrie. He was a character. He lost a leg in World War I, but he still played a mean game of tennis. He was an expert in computational astronomy, of whom it was said that he did not make allowances for the frailties of others and was far from tactful in pointing them out. He was a demanding mentor to Cecilia. Under his guidance, she assembled her own personal set of mathematical tables, and it was LJ who took her to the British Astronomical Association in London as his guest to listen to a lecture given by Harlow Shapley, the director of the Harvard College Observatory. Afterwards, Cecilia went back to her dorm, and as she had done with Eddington, she transcribed Shapley's lecture word for word into a notebook. With absolutely no prospects for an astronomy job in England, she began a handwritten correspondence with Shapley. First, a heartfelt letter seeking a job at the Harvard Observatory, followed by, when Shapley expressed interest, her qualifications. And if you look at these letters, you'll see there's not even a scratched out word. It must have taken her many drafts to get them just like this. It worked. She got Shapley to offer her a fellowship for a year's work at Harvard. She packed her clothes in a trunk and boarded a Cunard liner bound for the United States. She put a snapshot of her friend Betty Leaf in her wallet. Now, what's happening here is this: physics as a form of scientific study is emerging, and physics was now being combined with other disciplines to make great discoveries. Rutherford was fusing physics with chemistry to understand the nucleus of an atom. Bohr was fusing physics with his quantum theory to study molecular structure. And Einstein was fusing physics with mathematics to produce his theory of relativity. So might young woman graduate student Cecilia Payne be able to fuse physics with astronomy to understand the known universe, to determine what stars are made of? Now, for the three of you out there who don't know the answer to that, let's find out. I must confess that in Massachusetts, I have found a stony-hearted stepmother. That's how Cecilia described where she had landed in the fall of 1923. The Harvard College Observatory was located on Concord Avenue at the northwest edge of the campus. High up on a hill, its windows glowing deep into the night, it was unlike any other building. Cecilia's daughter, Catherine, remembers it had a spookily delightful spiral staircase, a creaky dumbwaiter, and a dusty catacomb. A number of women were employed at the observatory before Cecilia got there. Wilhelmina Fleming, Antonio Maury, Annie Jump Cannon, Henrietta Leavitt. They were known as computers, and their job was to observe and catalog every star that the observatory's telescope could find. They did an amazing job. They produced 9 250-page volumes of stellar classifications. Cecilia knew just 2 of them. She would work late at night with Antonio Maury, that's her in the upper right, who insisted on keeping the windows open so that the 2 of them were bitten unmercifully by mosquitoes, and Annie Cannon in the lower left, who could classify spectra at the astonishing rate of 300 stars every hour. They didn't do it all alone, however. There were a number of assistants with their own idiosyncrasies. There was Louisa Wells, who Cecilia remembered as sitting at her desk, marking stars on a glass plate, and then falling asleep and rubbing all the marks off with her nose. And Edward King, who admonished Cecilia to never record the time of ending an exposure until the shutter had actually been closed. One might die in the interval, and the record would then be inaccurate. There are so many oddball characters in this book. I can only touch on a few of them. But that's all the computers did. They classified. They didn't try to analyze or understand. It's like they stocked a library with hundreds of thousands of books and didn't read any of them. There were 2 reasons. First, it wasn't their job. And secondly, none of the computers had been trained in physics and in astronomy as Cecilia had been. They just collected specimens, that's all. They were a quirky bunch of characters, but to Cecilia, far from her mother, far from her brother and sister, far from home, they soon became like family. Now it was time to put all her Cavendish lab learning to work. First stop was the office of Harlow Shapley, the director of the observatory and the man who hired her. Shapley thought he was getting another hard-working computer. He was wrong. She reminded him that she was on a fellowship. She was technically not an employee. Shapley then asked, well, what did she want to do? All those stellar spectra on glass plates, they were like a million jigsaw puzzle pieces waiting for someone to put them together. She said she wanted to focus her Cavendish lab training on what was stored away in those dusty catacombs. In other words, introduce astrophysics to the Harvard College Observatory. Now, Shapley may not have been able to dictate what Cecilia would do during her fellowship, but he was a smart man. The observatory had always been more or less an outpost. He was determined to create a true department of astronomy at Harvard, but to do that, he would need a doctoral candidate. He told Cecilia she could have her run of the place. All she had to do was write a thesis. Neither of them knew at the time what a momentous thing that would turn out to be. So Cecilia now turned her trained eye on all those glass plates. At first, she described them as little more than tiny parallel smears. How was she supposed to apply astrophysics to smears? Another obstacle, which is exactly when the smears started to make sense. Now, you and I can't see it, but she could. Silicon first, then carbon. She could see a relationship between ionization levels and temperature. Finally, she wrote later, some light dawned in the darkness. But as she worked her way down the periodic table, she could see that stars were composed mostly of hydrogen, like 1,000,000 times more hydrogen than the astronomical community had assumed. It was heresy. From Eddington on down, the established men of science believed that stars were composed of the same elements as Earth and in roughly the same proportions. Heated up Earths, if you will. These are two of the established men, Shapley on the right and Henry Norris Russell on the left. Russell was the director of the Princeton Observatory and the dean of American astronomers. When he read a draft of Cecilia's thesis, he felt compelled to warn her. There is something seriously wrong with the present theory, he wrote to Cecilia. It is clearly impossible that hydrogen should be 1,000,000 times more abundant than the metals. She was cornered. Now, in order to get her thesis, Stellar Atmospheres, published, as demanded by Shapley, she had to accommodate Russell. So she hedged. She described her conclusion that hydrogen dominated the composition of stars as almost certainly not real. Almost certainly. As historian David Dvorkin described it, she was crafty, choosing her words in a manner that was designed to record for posterity that she was the first to make this observation, right or wrong. In so doing, Payne can be credited with profound political acumen. She always regretted it, is what Cecilia's daughter, Catherine, told me in an interview, talking about Cecilia's decision to deny the results of her research. She didn't dwell on it, Catherine said, but throughout her life, she lamented that decision. Now, of course, in hindsight, it's clear that Cecilia, looking down at those slides, had done what centuries of astronomers had tried to do by looking up through telescopes, determine what stars are made of, one of the most fundamental of all scientific discoveries. Her findings were dismissed because the veteran astronomers at the time did not have the same training in physics that she had. In other words, they could not peer as deeply into the universe as she could. With the thesis complete, Cecilia could finally come up for air, live a little, as she put it. Her best friend at the observatory was Adelaide Ames, another young researcher. They were so close that they came to be known as the Heavenly Twins. Adelaide worked as Shapley's assistant. She was very much under his thumb and unavailable. So when Cecilia decided to drive cross-country, she took her roommate along, Frances Wright. That's her in the center. They took Cecilia's car. She had saved up enough money to buy a 1930 Model T. Around this time, Cecilia crossed paths with this man, Norbert Wiener. Norbert would become a mathematics professor at MIT. He was known for stopping in on fellow professors, knocking off his cigar ashes in the blackboard chalk tray, and then asking which way had he come in. When he got the answer, he would say, "Oh, good, that means I've had lunch." He and Cecilia met on board ship during one of Cecilia's trips back to England. 31-year-old Norbert fell madly in love with 25-year-old Cecilia. He wrote to his mother, "As you know, we are going back on the same boat. A lot can happen on a boat." Poor Norbert, a lot didn't happen. The more he pressed, the more Cecilia backed away. She was living in America now. She was going to have a career as a scientist and not just be the supportive wife of an irrepressible professor. Meanwhile, there was a crack in the wall of belief that earthly metals were the principal elements of stars. 4 years after Cecilia's thesis was published, Norris Russell, the man who told her she was wrong, finally concluded that hydrogen is far more abundant than the other metals. His research agreed with Cecilia's, but he buried that fact toward the end of the paper he published. He got the credit at the time because, as historian David Dvorkin puts it, he knew what the community would accept. Cecilia was teaching astronomy courses now, although her name was not listed in the Harvard course catalog. She did have her own apartment, but her salary was regrettable. She was paid out of Shapley's equipment budget. But the steadiness was tempered by sadness. 10 years after arriving at Harvard, she learned that her close friend, Betty Leaf, at Cambridge, had drowned. She would not be the only one. Adelaide had been on a lake when a storm tossed her out of a canoe. She soon disappeared. Shapley himself took charge of the search. It took 10 days to recover the body. Cecilia was devastated. Adelaide and Betty were dead and I was alive, she wrote later. I was absorbed in my work, shy and unattractive. I made a silent resolve. I would embrace life. She needed to get away from the US, away from the observatory. She didn't do what probably you and I would do in the dead of winter, go to a beach somewhere. Instead, she went first to Pulkovo. a remote observatory on the outskirts of St. Petersburg in Russia, and then by train to Lower Saxony in Germany for a meeting of the German Astronomical Society. As she was sitting in the back of the auditorium, a conference official with a bundle of mail in his arms walked by calling out, "Miss Payne, Miss Payne." After she identified herself, a young man approached. His name was Sergei Gaposchkin. He was there to meet the renowned American astronomer Cecilia Payne. He was obviously taken aback. Because of her reputation, Cecilia later recalled he had expected that Miss Payne would be a little old lady, and he was surprised to find her no older than himself. Sergei told her that he was a Russian astronomer in Berlin. He couldn't stay in Germany and he couldn't return to Russia. He gave her a handwritten account of his life and asked, could she help him? On the train back to Cambridge, August 12, 1933, she took out a paper and pen and wrote a 6-page letter to Shapley about Sergei. It was classic Cecilia, detailed, thorough, organized. There was also something else, something missing from all her other correspondence. It was emotional. I am not ashamed to confess that I literally passed a sleepless night after my first talk with him. He came from Berlin to Göttingen on his bicycle, 4 days' journey, carrying his provisions with him. I shall long remember how we walked up the main street, Gaposchkin nervously giving the salute to passing brown shirts. He is small but strong and of a happy exclamation point disposition. Forgive me if I speak strongly, it is not a rash impulse and it comes from the heart. She traveled to Washington to push for a visa for Sergei. She pressured Shapley to hire him. She was typically relentless. It worked. By December, Sergei had his own desk at the Harvard Observatory. And 3 months later, they slipped away to New York, where, as Cecilia described it, in March 1934, I became Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin. Their disappearance and marriage was a surprise to the astronomical community. One story, undoubtedly a myth, was that upon hearing the news, Annie Cannon fainted dead away. It was Henry Norris Russell, though, who best captured the mood. I sincerely hope that it turns out splendidly, he wrote in the letter. But I keep wondering how it happened. As the years went by, there were changes in Cecilia's life. One was that she and Sergei had children, 3 altogether. Some things, though, did not change. Although she taught many astronomy classes, she remained relatively anonymous. It was Shapley who told her why. Abbot Lawrence Lowell, the president of Harvard, had told him years earlier that because she was a woman, Miss Payne should never have a position in the university as long as he was alive. Another change came in 1954. Donald Menzel replaced Harlow Shapley as director of the Harvard Observatory. One of the first things he did was to double Cecilia's salary. And with Lowell no longer president of the university, he made another change. The New York Times, that newspaper again, June 21, 1956. Harvard University announced today the appointment of Dr. Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin as professor of astronomy. She is the first woman to attain full professorship at Harvard through regular faculty promotion. About her appointment, Cecilia wrote later, I have reached a height that I should never in my wildest dreams have predicted 50 years ago. Sadly, one of the things that did not change in all those years was Cecilia's smoking habit. Harvard professor Owen Gingerich, a student of Cecilia's, described it best. A pack of cigarettes and a single match could get her through the entire period. It caught up with her finally. Cecilia died of lung cancer in December 1979. In searching for an Indian quote to describe this woman who was so captivated by the simple thrill of discovery, I thought the best was a bit of advice she once gave. She was talking to students who were considering science, but her words apply to everyone who feels the need to understand. Do not undertake a scientific career in quest of fame or money. There are easier and better ways to reach them. Undertake it only if nothing else will satisfy you, or nothing else is probably what you will receive. Your reward will be the widening of the horizon as you climb, and if you achieve that reward, you will ask no other. Okay, now, as promised, back to that portrait. The portrait hangs in University Hall, which means that Cecilia's presence is in the room today for many an important meeting at Harvard. University Hall contains portraits of a number of important figures in the university's history. Here's another one. Abbot Lawrence Lowell, the 22nd president of Harvard University, the same man who once said that Cecilia Payne should never have a position in the university as long as he was alive. Surely Cecilia would appreciate the irony. Her eyes are looking left and slightly up, meaning she now gazes at him on that very same wall, no more than 30 feet away. Okay, that's it. Thank you all for paying attention, and I guess I will now stop sharing so that we could do a little Q&A if you have questions. See if I can do this here. Okay.
Okay, Tom. Okay, Tom, it looks like you have the first question. You can unmute yourself.
Right. Thank you, Donovan, and thank you, Russell. It's a fascinating report, and I'm certainly going to purchase the book. You know, I'm reminded that Hubble has a orbiting satellite telescope in his name. Cassini had a probe orbiting Saturn that took these fascinating pictures. What were her accolades? What were her, any awards for her?
Yes. Yes, she won actually, I believe it's the American Astronomical Society has an award for the most effective woman astronomer, and she won it many years after her thesis. And oddly enough, it's called the Henry Norris Russell Award. The same man who told her that she was wrong with her thesis. So yes, she won that award, and there were a number of accolades she won, but the best was the fact that she was made the first woman professor at Harvard through regular promotion. Others?
Well, I'll carry on. I'll just make a comment, if you will.
Sure.
I've always been interested in space travel and that sort of thing. If all of you have never visited the Mount Wilson Observatory in Southern California, I suggest you do so. It is a 100-inch telescope there. Currently it's closed, obviously, because of the virus issues, but they've had limited tours that begin at 9 o'clock in the evening and go to 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning. Hubble did a lot of his work in this particular dome. And when you go there, and it's cold and dark, etc., you get a sense of how these people worked. And you actually can sit in the seat that Hubble sat in. He is known to have ate a bologna sandwich. But when you look through this telescope, which is original, and the rotunda is original, it's remarkable to see the universe through this scope. And it's fascinating to see the moon and Saturn, et cetera. So again, I invite you, and I'm planning to go back down there when they reopen, but it's a night tour of Mount Wilson. It's a fascinating event. Wear a heavy sweater, but don't miss it. It's a great show to see. Thank you.
Great. You know, you're saying that, Tom, it being cold and everything at the observatory, it reminds me of a quote. I just want to read it real quick. I just love this quote. It's in the author's note of the book. And I quote Richard Forte. Richard Forte was a English paleontologist. And he said, quote, "The excitement of discovery cannot be bought or faked. It provokes a whoop of enthusiasm that can banish frozen fingers from consideration and make a long day too short." Don't you just love that? Love that quote? That's really the essence of the book. It's the, yes, it is her life, and her life was fascinating, but it's also a book about the thrill of discovery. And that's what really gives the book its power, I think. Okay.
Donovan, we have a question here.
Sure.
What was the process and how long did it take to gather all the facts for your research to do this book? It seems like there was a lot of research involved.
Yeah. I started it in 2016, as I said. So it was about 4 years by the time I started until the book was published. Harvard University Press is the publisher. And it was a wonderfully interesting process because I'm not a scientist. I'm not a historian. I was just a writer, you know, looking for a good idea. So I didn't have to write the book. I wasn't a professor who was under the gun of publish or perish, or I wasn't an activist with a mission to push. I was just this lowly writer looking for a good idea. But by not having an agenda, I think that's what makes the book so different. I wrote it simply because it was such a compelling story. So on one level, it is a well-researched biography. I promise you, Harvard would not publish a book that was not rigorous in its scientific and historical accuracy. But on another level, it's a narrative about that basic human need to understand, to figure out, and to explain. She had this relentless need to know, and it's what really drove her. Derided in class, denied teaching credit, told she was wrong. None of that mattered. She stepped on all those obstacles as she pursued the hunt. So in a way, that's a whole other level than just a biography. But it was I loved every minute of it. As I said, I traveled to Cambridge. I went to London. I spent a lot of time at the Harvard Observatory. I mentioned that Professor Owen Gingrich. I spent a lot of time in his office. He was very patient about it. And the writing was just, the story was so good that the writing the book kind of wrote itself.
Perfect. We have a question from T. Dietz. You can unmute yourself and please ask your question.
Yeah, hi, Donovan. Tom here. Very nice presentation. Thank you. Appreciate it. Tell me, was the record ever set straight between Russell and Cecilia relative to the hydrogen's role in star formation?
Yeah. When Russell wrote his report on page 71, he did say, Cecilia Payne at Harvard did this research a couple of years ago, but it was buried so far down in the report that no one saw it. Now, in the astronomical community, they kind of know that Cecilia did what she did, but in the population at large, no one really knew. So is
that true to this day?
Until the book gets read, pretty much, yeah.
Fascinating.
Right.
All right, Donovan, we have a question from Pam.
Sure.
Pam, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, Donovan. I just wanted to ask, since you had a snapshot of her siblings in your research, did you find out about her siblings' accomplishments?
Yes, she had two brothers, one of whom is dead, one of whom died relatively early, and her daughter, Catherine, is still alive, and one of her other brothers is still alive. Catherine, the brother who's still alive was not cooperative particularly. He just didn't want to get involved. But Catherine, her daughter, was terrific. She was very enthusiastic. She had a lot of those old photographs there are more old photographs in the book, but the ones I showed, Catherine gave me. And she was very forthcoming in interviews. She was just great. So I've not been in touch with Catherine. She's older now, and I've tried a couple times to email her and send her a book, but I have not heard word. The other person, though, is her brother's daughter, named, if you can believe it, Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin. And she is a professor at Dartmouth, and I have been in touch with her. And she has a copy of the book. In fact, Harvard made a very good suggestion. They said, why don't you and Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin, the younger, do a joint presentation? So we're working on that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Awesome. Any more questions for Donovan?
Okay.
Oh, we have one from Gil. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Gil. Feel free to ask the author.
Donovan, thanks for a great presentation. So my question is, this took you through many geographical areas and intellectual exercises. You met a tremendous number of people. Must have been a sense of accomplishment when you finished, but also perhaps a vacuum. How did you feel after this long exercise, and do you have another project underway?
Ooh, I hate that question. Well, all along the way, I didn't feel a sense of loss particularly because I was so involved. And Harvard was great. I have a wonderful agent. Her name is Esther Newberg. She's with ICM in New York. And she had sent the manuscript out to a number of big New York publishing houses, and they had all said, oh, nice story, but not for us. And through that professor at Harvard, Owen Gingrich, the manuscript found its way to Harvard. And they wrote and said, understand you have a manuscript, we'd like to read it. And so I said, well, I have a proposal, I have an outline, I have sample chapters, I have the whole manuscript. What would you like to see? So they said, send me the manuscript. So I did, and to their credit, they wrote back an email with green light. I'll never forget it, in the body of the email message. So what Harvard did, like they do with all manuscripts, is they put it out for review. It was reviewed by a woman physicist at UC Irvine. Her name is Virginia Trimble. It was reviewed by David Dvorkin. He's the curator at the Smithsonian. And, you know, these reviewers were tough, I have to say. They would write in the margin BAH every now and then, bah. Or they would write YUK, yuck. So I flew to Irvine. I took the train to Washington. I worked with both of them to get rid of the bahs and the yucks, if you will. And then Harvard, which is an academic press, Harvard is, like other academic presses, employs a number of fact checkers. And there was a woman at Harvard Press, Louise Robbins is her name. She's a fact checker, and she was relentless. Every single page of the manuscript had a note in the margin, you know, like a comment, a question, mostly along the lines of, how do you know this? So I had to go back and make sure that, you know, Louise was satisfied with everything on every page. So that's a long-winded way of saying it was such a wonderful, involved process that I didn't feel too much the letting go. Only when the last page was sent to the printer, that's when I began to sit back and think, now what am I going to do? And I'm still in that position, and I'm a bear to live with because I don't have the next idea. It should be nonfiction. It should have powerful themes and interesting people. And that's very, very hard to find. You know, but I feel like you got to be disciplined and you got to wait for the right subject because, you know, I'm a good enough writer to write a biography, but if I wait and find the right subject, it will, like this one, almost tell itself, and it'll be an easier process. So still on the hunt. If anyone there has an idea, by all means, let me know. But thank you, Gil, for the question.
Well, good luck with your search.
Thank you.
All right, now we have a question from Carla.
Oh,
Carla, you can unmute yourself.
Hold on.
there we go.
Did I do it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, good. I was wondering, besides the predominance of hydrogen in the stars, what else in her discoveries was significant?
Yeah. When she finished her thesis, she was no longer had a fellowship. So now Shapley hired her. So now she was an employee, and Shapley could direct what she would do. So he took her away from studying stellar spectra, which was really too bad. It was too bad for science. It was particularly bad for Cecilia because that was her forte. And there's not much she could do about it because he was in charge. So he really assigned her over the years to study what are called variable stars. These are stars that shine bright and then don't, and there are reasons why. So she spent a lot of time studying variable stars that the astronomers did not spend a lot of time at. So it was a wide open field, but it was kind of derided at the time as, you know, not serious astronomy, but that's what Shapley wanted, so that's what she did. And so when she spirited her husband-to-be out of Nazi Germany, the two of them went to work on variable stars, and they published a book together on that subject. So her later years were spent, her later research years were not spent on something as fundamental as what she discovered. And then she was finally made professor and then actually made chairman of the astronomy department. So that took up the rest of her time until, and so she, when she died in 1979, she was, you know, still technically working at Harvard.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
Very good. Any more questions for our author tonight? Otherwise, Donovan, I would have you put up that slide.
Oh yeah, I have to do a brief commercial. So I'm going to put this up. This is the end of the presentation, but the book can be bought, if you wish, at Sausalito Books by the Bay. That's the local bookseller here in Sausalito. And, you know, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I obviously hope you'll buy the book, not so much because it's, you know, more money for the author, but because I think it really is a story that should be read. Her life was most interesting and it deserves to be read. But also it's important to support local independent bookstores. So Sausalito Books by the Bay, there's the phone number, 415-887-9967, and the email address, info@SausalitoBooksByTheBay. So Cheryl Pop runs the bookstore, and I've worked it out with her. We're going to try an experiment. If you decide to purchase the book through the bookstore, if you give your name when you make the purchase, the bookstore is going to call me, and I'm going to come down and sign the book. I'll sign a book personally to you. Or if you give it, if you want to give it as a gift for someone, give us the name of the giftee, so to speak. And then I'll come down, sign the book, and then the bookstore will send the book out. So that's the phone number, and that's the email address, and that's the end.
Well, may I just close? Donovan, thank you. That was terrific. And I will personally buy a couple of books, one for myself and others. Great work, great publication, great research. When we do reopen at the Yacht Club, and we will, I assure you of that, please come by for lunch, brunch, dinner.
Oh.
We'd love to have you there. And I look forward to rowing with you. And I'll just make a comment. Ladies and gentlemen, earlier today, the launch of the 2 American astronauts was postponed. I believe it's going to be this Saturday. But it's worthwhile watching it because, again, we're launching men into space. Donovan, congratulations. Bravo. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Sausalito Yacht Club.
Good night.
Very
Bye-bye.
good.
Thank you, Russell.
Good night.
Bye-bye.